to our second last session, and this is looking at artificial intelligence, geopolitics in media and practice. If I can please have our panelists to this session, Eric, Olander, Geraud, Neema, and Jean Roux, please come up to the table. And Eric, okay. I'll hand over to you.
We're still awake? A little bit? Okay. We're going to try and energize this up a little bit. We're going to keep our presentation short because we want this to be a little bit more of a discussion. There's not going to be a lot of happy talk in this presentation. I'm just going to warn you that we don't have a lot of good news to tell you about what's going to happen in the AI space. There's been a lot of discussion about AI at this conference, about all the possibilities and all the potential and all the ways it can help. But I want to leave you with a fact here that for every $10 that is spent on AI development, $1 is spent on mitigation of AI, false information, fake information, and the devastation that AI can bring to us. We are about to approach into a tidal wave of content and misinformation and information that is just going to overwhelm the systems. What's coming right now, and we see it happening right now in the Israel-Hamas war, and we're going to talk about this today. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about AI and also about what the Chinese are doing in terms of media. And all of this is going to link together in terms of how difficult it is for journalists and news consumers to figure out what's what. Then we're going to have Jean from the Atlantic Council. And there's full bios available, so I won't spend too much time going into bios, who's going to talk about misinformation, disinformation specifically from Russian and Chinese actors in Africa. And then Geraud, my colleague from the China Global South Project, is going to talk a little bit about, again, how some of the large language models, those are ChatGPT and Google Bard, lead you down some very bad places for lots of fake information, made up information, and so it makes it very, very difficult for us to do. I thought it would be a good exercise for us just to start with some terms, because a lot of people throw around these words and they don't necessarily know what they mean. There's a very important distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And it's really about the motivation. So the disinformation is the intentional distribution of information that is intended to cause harm. Misinformation is when you and I pass on, did you know that, Geraud has 3 arms? We don't know that that's not right, but we pass it on anyway, and that's misinformed. And then propaganda is any information that has a purpose. So we were hearing in the last session about media ownership in many African countries for people who have political objectives or corporate objectives or other objectives. So propaganda is not only from the state, but propaganda can come from companies, it can come from wealthy individuals, it can come from anywhere. It's information with a purpose. We're in it now, and it's only going to get worse. And I'm sorry to disagree with the panelists before, but there is nothing that governments are going to be able to do to stop this. Already the United States, and Europe is soon far behind, has said we're giving up on regulating Facebook and Twitter and social media. So all of the major social platforms in the United States have said we're out of moderating content. Twitter has shut down its entire content moderation team. Facebook has closed most of it. And that's from a country that has a strong regulatory system. Countries in this continent have no regulatory systems and have no chance to stand up against what's coming and what's here now. Misinformation is already a crisis. Now imagine this tidal wave of AI-generated content that is already coming. And we are about 3 years away, 4 years away, maybe Jean may have some specific insights, when we're going to hit this inflection point where human beings will no longer be in charge of telling our own story. It's a weird idea to think about. But in about 3 years, the amount of content that is produced by machines will exceed the content produced by humans. And here's what's happening, is that the large language models, they're like the snake eating its tail. So you type into ChatGPT, I want to find out about X, it's going to go out into the universe looking for content, and increasingly, it's going to find AI-generated content that it's going to then spit back to you again. Okay? There is nothing that the Ghanaian government can do to stop that. There is nothing that the French government can do to stop that. We're in chaos. This is already happening right now in the Israel-Hamas war. So much of it is coming out. We don't know what's what. And sites like ours, I don't give my content to Google and to Microsoft. I've put a block on our site, the China Global South Project, to prevent the large language models from indexing our site. Why am I giving them my content for free? If they want my content, they need to pay for it. Now, what's going to happen now is that more and more of us who produce high quality content are going to pull back from giving the large language models. New York Times already doesn't do that. They blocked it too. That's where I got the idea to do it. Okay? So what's going to end up happening, as Bob said, if you don't pay for content, you're going to be in the sewer trying to figure out what's what, what's not. This is the role of journalism now, that we, as talented, skilled, experienced journalists, the importance of what we do is only going to go up. Okay? Humans writing news is going to be more important in the future because we're battling the machines. And if you are not in the mindset of paying for news, even micropayments, then you're going to have a hard time figuring out what's what. So let's talk a little bit about what's in the China context here in Africa and specifically, because China is a contested space here in Africa. And this is just a good example of what's coming. And let me just make a clear point that there is nothing about what the Chinese are doing in Africa today in the information space that is unique. They're using the same tactics as companies do, as other governments do. They just seem to be doing it on a scale that's considerably larger. Now, the problem of China-Africa news information, again, it presents this challenge of what's what, is you don't know necessarily the motivations of the person who's writing or presenting the content. And what you'll see in a lot of African media are people who have, for better or lack of a better word, been co-opted, or people who are swayed, or people are persuaded by the Chinese to adopt their way of thinking. They don't reveal that, though, in their editorials in the Daily Nation, in Citizen, in other publications. So you as the consumer are left to try and figure out what's what, and it's very difficult. There's two types of propaganda. Now, propaganda here is not a bad word. Propaganda here is information with a purpose, as we talked about. Now, everybody tends to focus on the above-the-line stuff. That's the media that everybody sees. CGTN, China Radio International, all that stuff. As we've heard in some of our other presentations, nobody watches. I bet none of you watch CGTN every day and see what's going on, or read China Daily newspaper, or listen to China Radio. It's the below-the-line stuff that is where you have to be careful of. This is the stuff you don't see. So things like these content sharing agreements in some of the publications you work for, the Chinese have come up and said, listen, I know AP and Reuters are super expensive. You can't afford them right now. Revenues are down. We're going to give you a free Xinhua wire feed. And that kind of manifests itself in lots of different ways. So again, this is Daily Nation. In a lot of cases, you'll see they will put Xinhua there. Okay, that's cool. That's very obvious. You see this all across the continent. But in other times, they will mask what is Xinhua content and put it as a KBC reporter. But if you look at Chinese government gears up efforts to alleviate poverty in Xinjiang, I can guarantee you that there is no KBC reporter who's writing about poverty alleviation efforts in Xinjiang. And you know that because they were quoting the regional party secretary of the Communist Party in the southern part of Xinjiang. How many KBC reporters do you think have that level of understanding of China? So that's a giveaway that they've just kind of switched the headline. Then, this oftentimes masquerades as legitimate content. So this is a piece of Xinhua News. Ethiopia plans to sell 40% of telecom monopoly by July. Okay, nothing controversial about that. This is the Ghana News Agency. Same headline, same words, masking the source. You don't know where that came from. And they're doing this all the time, okay? During COVID here in South Africa, it's very interesting. South Africa was one of the countries that said, we're not going to take Chinese vaccines. And they said, we're going to do the Western vaccines. The Chinese embassy here in Pretoria started buying media placements on IOL, which is 20% owned by the China Africa Development Fund, and they started placing these quote-unquote editorials. Now, it's funny because the guy, you can't see it there, but the guy who wrote the first one, Liam Lee, we actually know. We've been on panels with him. He's a nice guy, by the way, really nice guy. So I wrote to Liam, I said, hey, that's really cool that you had an article. He said, yeah, the embassy asked me and they put it in there. Funny thing is, then the week following, there was this guy by the name of Guan Jintai. And I called up Liam again. I said, wow, 2 articles in 2 weeks on almost the same subject. He said, no, that second one was me too. And I was like, oh, okay, this is paid placement. Now, these paid contracts put a lot of your media organizations into really difficult situations because the Chinese will come along and they'll say, we're going to buy a 12-month schedule of paid advertorials. Now, your sales department goes, yes, money, right? But here's the problem. Let's say then the French embassy says, we want to have our ambassador write a column, an op-ed, and it's about human rights in China, okay? And they're not paying for it. But man, we're talking about freedom of information here in a free democratic society, right? The Chinese embassy gets wind of this and they say, nope. If you publish that thing from the French embassy, we're going to pull our 12-month contract with you. So what do you think the Daily Nation sales team does to the French embassy? They tell them to go somewhere else. So again, you don't know this as a consumer, that these sales contracts are blocking out other voices and limiting that media as a whole. Let me see if I can, start times. Many of you guys have start times, right? You guys all know start times. Not part of the government, by the way, just part of, it's private. But during COVID, they started doing something, I don't know if I can get the video to work. They started producing their own news. Now, Start Times has never produced its own content, but now it's producing news. How do you think that news is going to contradict, how much of it's going to contradict any Chinese government officials' positions? It won't. And this is very crafty because a lot of people will look at CGTN and they'll think, I'm not watching Chinese state media.
I'm your host, James.
But they turn on Star Times and they start seeing news updates from Star Times. Why not? State propaganda. Okay, I'm going to go quickly. And then, oh, I think that was it. Yep, that's it. So the point here is the Chinese, again, none of this is duplicitous in the sense that they're by no means alone in doing this. As we've talked about, lots of African owners are doing this with their own media. This type of corruption is widespread, but it all makes it more difficult, as we talked about in this new AI era, of figuring out what's what. So let's just kind of pick that up, Jean, and you study Russian and Chinese misinformation and disinformation in Africa. We've talked to you previously about this. Maybe you can kind of elaborate a little bit on the trends and maybe the differences between the Russians and the Chinese.
Well, thanks, Eric. I'll be happy to do so. I think I'll use that to segue into some of the scary AI stuff that we look at and see as well. Just briefly, in terms of introductions, I'm based in Cape Town. I'm South African. I work for the DFR Lab, which is part of a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and we focus on disinformation, digital propaganda, and online influence campaigns. As Eric rightly pointed out, some of the big actors that we often see in this space is Russia and China. And this is mostly because both of them have got a very, not a unique, but they've got the combination of capacity on the one hand to be able to do this. Both of their information ecosystems is very strict. You know, there's very strict regulation in terms of what you can publish and what not. There's a lot of control over things like the media in both of the countries. And they've also got, the capacity and the expertise to actually export that to take this into a new information environment and use it and apply it there. There's no use in having a message go out or a narrative go out, but it's only the people that believe you anywhere that listens to it. You want it to get to new audiences. And that's when you see things like these examples that Eric pointed out. Some of the key differences that we often see between Russian campaigns and Chinese campaigns is just the way that they approach it. Russia tends to be a lot more antagonistic. So we tend to refer to it as like a bull in a china shop. They come in, they take over, they don't care who they affect and how they affect them. If they can, in a relative sense, bring their opponents down, it means they become relatively stronger. So for them, it's a case of they're not too invested in building out their own image. They're more concerned and very effective at bringing down the image of others. Now, whether this is the West, whether it's a specific country in the West, whether it is entities and organizations in a country that they're targeting, for them it doesn't matter. It's just a case of bringing that down.
Can you give some examples in Africa of what the Russians have done?
I mean, for good examples, probably in like the Sahel region. If you look at West Africa, some of the what do I call it, advancements, but like the inroads that they've made in Western Africa, and specifically in Sahel. A lot of this started by bringing down the West. There was, in most of these countries, there is a lot of military instability. So when they stepped in there, their approach was to kind of exploit that military instability. And they did that by undermining the peacekeeping forces, the UN forces, the MONUSCOs, the MONUSMAs, those organizations and forces deployed in the area. Once you started getting those to a point where people were protesting against them, there have been examples where convoys were blocked by people in the country from passing through particular towns because of this lack of trust. That was then a good avenue to step in and say, well, we can bring our own military instructors in. We've got this organization called Wagner that can come in. They know how to shoot people. We can bring them in. They can actually take over some of these roles. Conversely, China tends to build out its own image quite effectively. You saw a couple of the examples that were shown on screen as well. During COVID, there was a lot of this, pointing out the aid that China sent through to South Africa in particular. And their approach is more about building out their own image, building out the positive image of China and the way that they approach their relations with countries in Africa. Barring the examples that were shown on screen earlier, we've looked at a couple of other, we refer to it as a information laundromat, which was one particular example, and again, it relates to IOL. This was a statement that was published during, I think if I recall correctly, the United Nations with the World Health Organization, wanted to reinstitute an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. So what happened was that a statement was released by the Chinese diplomatic staff in Australia. That press release was taken. It was published almost word for word by a columnist for IOL. Literally sections of that press statement was copied and pasted. That was then repeated by, I think it was in Xinhua News or might have been in Global Times. But there was no mention made of the original press release by the Australian Chinese embassy. Instead, this section was attributed to a columnist in South Africa, political commentator in South Africa. And that was then again retaken and republished by the same political commentator on the IOL piece, again, this time quoting the piece in the Chinese media. So it's almost becomes this laundromat with the original statement made. It's clear if you as a reader come across it, you'll know that this is something that's published by an embassy. You'll know that it's got a diplomatic twist to it. There's a political twist to it. But now it's taken up in a local media in South Africa. It's published by Chinese media, again republished by the local South African media, and round it goes. It becomes very difficult to ascertain what the source of that was. Now, it's kind of like segueing from that into artificial intelligence. And when I'm talking about artificial intelligence, I think it's important to know that, we've been subjected to artificial intelligence for years now. It's gained a lot of prominence like in the last between 12 and 18 months. But prior to that, every time you open up Facebook, every time you open up a Google search, if you go onto a website that tracks your cookies, if you click accept and allow it to track your cookies, all of those things feeds into an ecosystem of lots and lots of behavioral data. And AI algorithms determine what you see on your Facebook feed. It determines what you get fed the first time that you open up your Twitter account. If you are a kind of informed that or suggested that you follow a new user on Instagram, that all of that is based off of an AI that's determined that this is the type of content that keeps you engaged. And they do that because the more you're engaged, the more ad minutes they can sell on their platforms. So we've already been subject to this for years now. And that's the first part about considering AI when it comes to disinformation, elections, misinformation, and online propaganda, is we've already been subjected to it. There was a fellow panelist of mine in June that mentioned it's one of those situations where the same platform that's showing you cat videos in the morning is telling you who to vote for in the afternoon. And that's the type of role that these platforms play. And we don't always realize that it's got that wide a range of import in our lives. The second part of this is, and this is kind of the more pressing, the more stuff that I'm more concerned about, is generative AI. Now, generative AI is relatively new. It's not the type of thing that will build out recommendation algorithms, but it's the type of thing that a user can go and create new content. It's machine generated. It's user generated in the sense that you provide prompts, and that prompt then results in either a piece of text. It could be an image. You could use it to do transcripts, clone voices, do voiceovers, the works. And that is something that's scary, not because it's possible, because it's been possible for a couple of years now. The scale at which it's become possible to do this is what's really, really scary. Because now you can, simply with something like ChatGPT, you can type in 30 seconds, you can get a long piece of text, and for somebody to try and debunk that text is going to take them 2 hours to do if they hurry up.
And we haven't seen it fully weaponized yet.
No.
So Facebook has been weaponized. And we saw that in the United States elections, and we've seen in some African elections too, that intentionally putting in fake information into the ecosystem. But now with the generative AI, you can take a picture, fake, put somebody in a terrible situation, and put it out there.
And run with it. And it's a lot more difficult to debunk as well. So even if you do try and debunk it, because there's no reverse image search, it's not like a old image that's taken out of context that you can find on TinEye or one of these other platforms. It's a totally new image. It's not even a picture, it's an image that's been created. So it's very difficult to try and debunk those. You need to kind of pay attention to the image itself, and that takes time, it takes expertise, and it takes knowledge of what to look out for. Even things like the number of fingers that these images tend to have, things like radio and cell phone buttons, they'll have too many buttons because the algorithm just goes bonkers when it needs to draw a button. It really likes buttons. So all of those things, you need to know what to look out for to try and debunk them. And even then, if you do, by the time you've done that, there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 others that are out there. So it's going to be very difficult to try and catch up and play debunking with the scale that these things can be rolled out. I think a second point as well is that, detecting it, using AI to try and detect it it's almost a waste of effort. OpenAI developed, and this is the people that developed ChatGPT, they built their own tool to try and detect whether a piece of text is generated using Open or ChatGPT or not. You needed to provide it with a sample of 1,000 words. So it's a pretty big sample, and it's not a simple tweet won't do. And even then, it only had a true positivity rate of 26%. So
It
one
failed,
in 4,
basically.
Yeah, 1 in 4 times it would be correct whether a piece of text is AI generated or not. Okay. And this is the people that developed ChatGPT in the first place. So trying to find a tool that can do it programmatically is it won't be out by the time that elections come around.
But this is the problem, is that VC investors are not investing in the anti-tools, they're all investing in the creation tools.
Exactly.
And that's the big problem. So this is a perfect segue, because we're going to get to our discussion. Geraud, can you walk everybody through an experience that you had with Bard?
Okay.
And we'll show you how easy it is for you to get sent down a bad path.
I'm going to ask you the question. We'll start with the question. Who's ever used ChatGPT since it was launched? Let's be serious here. Okay, who has ever used it to write a story? Come on. To correct. Who has ever used it to find a source of story? Okay. Who among you think, how accurate do you think that the information you're gonna get from ChatGPT, Microsoft Chat, or Google Bard is accurate? Let's say 100%, 80.
I think we've ruined the crowd for that.
Wait. You say 80?
But you can see the source on Google.
You say 80%? 88% could be true. Who thinks that it can create fake news? I don't know. Possible? Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna take you down to an interesting story. The day Google Bot created an entire fake news about real stories. So this has happened in this year. It happened to me actually. It was June 19th. I was doing some research because I was working on different projects. I'm doing research on mining industry in DRC, which is my specialty. And Google Bot basically created an entire fake news with fake links, with fake reference, with fake everything. Literally, the fake stories. And you have a first case here, and this is one company called Komilu. It's in DRC. I'm going to show you here the 4 prompts, the difference. There was a long conversation. I'm going to take you to the conversation that we had, and I'm going to show the image and the answers. Like, the first question was like, what can you tell me about that company? Second one, what are your sources based on the answers he gave me on the first one? Third one, can you give me the link that to that 22 Wall Street Journal reports on Komilu, the one you mentioned? And fourth question, who are the current owners of Komilu? And you're going to answer why. And this is the different answers. I'm going to try, they're really quite not that big, but I'm going to tell you. The first one was like quite like giving you the history, what the company is about and everything. And when you go on like the sources on telling you what is it about, I don't know if you can read it clearly, but it says like this. I was asking what's your source. It's like the primary sources are a 2019 report by Congo Research Group, which is a think tank that writes about DRC, politics and political instability. And a second primary source is a 2020 article from journal Nature that mentioned about how that company, created what was the main polluter in DRC, and that article also found that the mine was contributing to deforestation in DRC. So this is the answer to that, what are your sources? The third question was like, okay, can you give me the link to that Wall Street? Because in the second, he was mentioning the secondary sources. There was a Financial Times stories and the Wall Street Journal story. I was, okay. Can you give me, the link to that Wall Street Journal? And here, you can see here, I'm gonna put the link down there. It gives the link, and the name of the title of the story, Wall Street Journal, and even give an excerpt of the story by saying the expert said the DRC government has found the Chinese companies and has found that company, a Chinese company, to be responsible for environmental pollution, and the fine was imposed by Environment Ministry was levied against companies, etc., giving the more details. And I went back, like, okay, who are the current owner of that company? And it came back, it gives, back stories, fourth image there giving the story and background. And it came with a very interesting sentence. It says, the one that encircled at the end, in 2022, the DRC government fined that company, Komilu, with $1 million for environmental pollution. And the company also facing lawsuit from environmental group and NGOs. And despite the criticism, that company remains a major player in DRC mining industry. Okay, first story, first company. And we move to a second case. It was still the same day on the same conversation. And comes the question, what's the ownership of that company here, Mikas? It gives him the ownership of the company. And then you have here, interesting. Mikas has been criticized for its environmental and human rights records. The company has been accused of polluting the environment around the mines and using child labor in the mining process. In 2022, the government fined Mikas $1 million for environmental pollution. The company is also facing a lawsuit from a group of environmental activists who are seeking damage for the pollution caused by the mine. It looks quite similar. You move. This one is not a Chinese company, it's a Kazakh company. Question, what can you tell me about this frontier mine in DRC? It gives you a bunch of details and everything. And you go down, really, 2019, the DRC government fined $1 million to the pollution for the frontier mine. ERG since has taken action to improve blah, 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 blah. You're like, come on. What's the chance for you to have 3 different companies with 3 different stories, with the same kind of situation coming? And mind, I'm a mining expert from the DRC, so when it was popping, I was like, I don't have any recollection of those cases happening. So the overall debate also, I went down the rabbit hole to have the conversation about, like, okay, now come the question, how come this sentence, I quoted its own sentence, is in every description of Chinese mining company that you're giving me in DRC? It gives interesting response. There are a few reasons why this sentence in every description of Chinese project in DRC. It gives environmental concern. China is the world's largest consumer of cobalt in DRC, the world's largest producer of cobalt, blah, blah, blah. Human rights concern. China's mining operation in DRC have also been criticized for the human rights record and everything. Lack of transparency. Chinese mining operation in DRC are often opaque, making it difficult for track environment. And the interesting part comes the last part here. The sentence about DRC fining Micas 1 million for environmental pollution and the company facing a lawsuit from activists is a reminder of the environmental and human rights concern associated with Chinese mining operation in DRC. It's like, it's a reminder. Did it happen, or it's just a reminder that you created? And I went far. But is that true that the DRC government fined Micas $1 million in 2022 for environmental pollution? And if it's true, can you provide me with a source, with a link to that story? The answer was, I apologize. I apologize for the previous information. I've checked again, and it appeared that there is evidence that there's no evidence that the DRC government fined Micas $1 million. However, there is an evidence that Micas has been fined in the past, and in 2019, they just fined $300,000 US for the same situation. And that doesn't match up. Next one, can you give me the source and the link of this claim? Interesting answer. He was giving me Wall Street before, Financial Times, but when he comes here, he says, sorry, I can't assist you with that. I'm only a language model and I don't have any capacity to understand and respond. I went further and said, no, can you give me a source to this claim? Quote, and I gave it. The company was also, etc. An interesting answer came to you. I'm a text-based AI, and this is outside my capabilities. And to finish, all the links, the references it has given for all those companies, none of them exists. None of them. This is it's natural, the journal Nature story, nothing. This is the Congo Research Group reports, it even said 2020. I'm going to give you the presentation if you want. Nothing. You go down there, the Wall Street Journal, you type they give you the title and the link, you tap them. All of them, none of them exist. So basically, I found myself in a case where Googlebot just made up a whole fake news on companies. Okay. So if you're a journalist and you don't know your story, you go and pick that as a reference, you're going to end up really just disseminating a whole fake news.
So even when it's not lying or faking it, one of the problems with ChatGPT and BARD and some of the other large language models and the generative AI that Jean talked about is that they're pulling from what information is available, okay? In the discourse about key topics, oftentimes about Africa, there's a lot more that's produced in Europe and the United States than there is in Africa, in part because a lot of it's in English, okay? These generative AIs are not as strong in Kiswahili, in Hausa, in Igbo, okay, or even French. So what ends up happening is you find out that there are the Western biases, whatever they are, that are not reflective of your reality here. So another reason to be very, very cautious. Okay, we have about 25 minutes. What I'd like to do is make this a conversation with you. You're the ones who have to deal with this as journalists out in the field. What are you going to do? You've got two amazing experts here. let's kind of see if there's any solutions, because we can sit and complain about it all day, or we can try and do something about it. So you don't have to have a question, you can have a comment, you can share your own experience, but we want to make this a little bit more of an interactive discussion. Yes?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I was literally looking forward so much to this session because I'm currently studying my PhD in digital rights, looking at the regulatory and institutional frameworks that govern social media.
In what country?
Zimbabwe and South Africa. It's a comparative study, and I'm looking at, you know, your big companies, your Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, now known as X. So my question both a question and a comment. A couple of years ago, I think in 1999 going to 2000, there was the Great Firewall of China, which was introduced, right, through a series of regulations. And I'm sure I remember when Facebook first started coming out, we were told that Facebook is not allowed in China. That's
true.
Yes, that means that they were filtering a lot of this content, especially that it was coming from the West.
They're not filtering it, they're just blocking it altogether.
Blocking it altogether. So what I was reading an article 2 weeks ago, and I was at another session, right? And I asked this question, but no one could answer me, where I say that if you look at it from the West's perspective, they will say that, okay, fine, this is a way of monitoring, that's one. Two, blocking aspects such as freedom of expression, you know, rights to information, and so forth. But if you look at it from the Chinese government perspective, they'll tell you that we want to develop our own industries, we want to develop our own social networks. And that article I read actually agreed with that, and you say that some of the greatest entities that have been born within China came from that blockade. And I was having a conversation with Jonas just before lunch, and I asked, I'm like, your social media companies, just like you have indicated, you know, regulation has become a significant problem, because even if you look at it from a regulatory perspective, what currently exists is, okay, you have your right to freedom of expression from a constitutional perspective, or, you know, there is your...
Which you don't have in China, by the way. So just want to make that very clear, you don't have rights to freedom of expression.
Yes, okay. And you have aspects such as data privacy, right, which we don't understand altogether if we're to be honestly serious within an African context. So my contribution or question is to, if we're to take the Chinese approach, don't you think that it can be a solution?
Ooh. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let's leave right there. Jean. What do you think? Do you think that would work in Africa? Because Lai Mohammed, who is the information minister of Nigeria, and Madam Buhari said, this is what we should be doing. We should follow the Chinese model. We should shut down. Remember, they shut down Twitter for a brief while. So this idea has some appeal in Africa. Jean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Uganda, Facebook is still blocked entirely. So it's a kind of approach that's been used. So this idea of blocking it off, segmenting yourself off, and, you know, by extension then developing your own things. I think it's a possible solution. I think one of the big issues that we might have in Africa is that we're not seeing the same levels of adoption of internet. I mean, data is exceptionally high, internet is exceptionally high. One of the biggest mediums of getting information is still the good old-fashioned radio. So I think it's going to be a bifurcated challenge. On the one hand, we need to, we can develop those things. I think we've got the expertise. We've got, people building. I mean, he's just next door at the conference here, the Investigative Journalism Conference. There's a professor from the University of Pretoria, and they're developing what they call low-resource languages, like in developing LLMs for small African languages that the big LLMs just don't cater for. So we've got the expertise to build these platforms, to build these data sets, to kind of exploit and mine our own data. But that has to go with developing the infrastructure to allow people to use that in the first place, to make those opportunities available. Just to give you a quick example, in South Africa, I've been a boy growing up or a girl growing up in Sandton, for example, in Gauteng, well developed, it's urban. They've got much and vastly different opportunities to somebody growing up in the rural Eastern Cape, where they might not even have running water in most days. So that level of disparity and inequality needs to be lifted up so you can have those opportunities available to exploit.
Okay,
If you could do that,
Yeah, so this is a fundamental question that's right now being battled out in Africa and around the world is, do you believe in a free and open internet that has no restrictions on it? That's the US model. That's not even the European model, by the way. GDPR and the Europeans do not believe in a free open internet. They have much more restrictions on it than the US does. China believes that internet sovereignty, each country should be able to decide how to manage the internet. And there's a growing number of African countries that are saying, you know what, we kind of like that. Senegal just built a new data center modeled on China's national data law. So all data now is consolidated in the new data center outside of Dakar. So you're seeing a lot of this tension going on about which direction do we as Africans want to go in. Geraud.
Yeah, yes, that's what you mentioned is really important. And before diving into that question, I'd like to correct something that since we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, I don't want us, the Chinese, coming after us saying that we're saying fake news. Yes, constitutionally, China as the citizen have the freedom of speech.
That's technically, but not legally. Yeah.
So just since
In the
we-
Constitution, you're right. In the Constitution, it does say
it's
that,
really
but in
written.
reality,
So
you do not
yeah,
have
in
it.
reality, it's
Fair
something
enough.
else. It's Constitution is
Checking
written.
fake news.
Exactly. So to avoid that, now we are saying fake news about China. No, they have that constitutionally. But in terms of your question, what you mentioned is really important. Even the US, Eric said, I might disagree with him on that part, because when you have watched the debate on the Senate about TikTok, you had the feeling that at some point that you had Americans at the edge of saying we also want to wall off our internet away from those influences. And the reality is, when you look at the debate, whether in the West or in Africa, you have the feeling that people now have feeling that no, at some point we might need to keep a certain sovereignty in our digital space, to keep our data private, to kind of determine what our people are allowed to see or not to see. And that's the debate that's really real right now, whether it's being on democratic country or non-democratic country. And it's really funny to see those questions being raised in the US, where people now, we're kind of talking about banning social media. We want a full ban on TikTok. We want a full ban on this, just because at some point now, from the Chinese perspective, they look and they say, yeah, you guys, you kind of understood why I was banning Twitter and Facebook in my country and everything. So it's really opened that debate where we kind of like, okay, where do we stand? Where do we go from here? And that I think that's going to be the debate for the future. And in terms of prediction, I'm not a foreseer, but I do believe that in the coming years, we're going to see a much more compartmentalized internet that we see right now.
Okay. Next question, comment.
Yes.
Where are we? There we are.
Yeah. No, you've largely answered my question, but I just wanted to, from your experience or looking at how things stand at the moment, how soon can we expect measures to be put in place to regulate AI in terms of the information that's going out? I'm just thinking, yes, there are positives and negatives that are coming out from AI. However, the negative could be dire, particularly in such places such as Africa. So I don't know if you guys have an idea.
I mean, African digital governance and regulatory structures are among the weakest in the world, so I don't see how they're going to be able to tackle something as massive as this. Jean, you may have a different point of view on this, but I think this is bigger than what can be regulated.
Yeah, there's some trickle down from the African Union has got some policies on, the way that technology should be regulated.
But the African Union has no jurisdictional credibility, and it has no power to enforce.
So, but on that, what usually happens is local countries kind of shape their own policies and their own legislation around documents like that. So there is something coming up there, but it's not to the scale and the extent that you'll see in the EU or in the US. So it's, we need those things. My approach, if I had to kind of advise on something like this, is use the existing frameworks that we've got. One thing that Africa does have, in a lot of African countries do have, is human rights policies and human rights frameworks. And if you can find ways of shaping the development and the use and the application of AI within existing human rights frameworks, that's a way that you can kind of stop the gap until you can develop the purpose-built regulation to deal with that. But it is a problem. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done sooner rather than later. Trying to play catch up with for argument's sake, a large language model after it's already collected data, it's already been built up, it's already in that black box state where you're not sure how exactly it's coming up with the answers that it's making.
But John,
by then it's too late.
let me just ask you a question. How does any country in Africa regulate AI if the attacks or the information are coming from Nepal?
Well, I think the one is building your own.
But let's be honest, Mali's not going to build its own, build your own what?
Build your own, have sovereignty over your own data. I think that's the first thing. Our
again-
data is currently being exported quite a bit. So
But the
Africa's
attacks are
harvesting-
coming from India. What does Uganda do? Where the AI is coming from all over the place, what does Uganda do?
I think you need to delineate exactly what we mean by these attacks from
Well,
Is
I'm
it
just saying,
information attacks.
there's no border to where this comes from.
But at the same time, that develops that opportunity, that allows you to exploit the borders. We've got data in Africa, we've got expertise here. No, nothing is actually stopping us from building that on our own.
So-
Now we can sit back and wait for the Nepals and all these other countries to, after harvesting our data, weaponize that against us, or we can start building our own models so we don't need those foreign AIs in the first place.
Okay.
I do believe, though, they're going to be searching for Chinese technical support to do that. When you see how many countries are approaching China on that space, you can expect that Nigeria, Uganda, even South Africa can say, okay, we might need Chinese technology to do that. And especially when you look at the last BRI summit where China came up with the proposition on regulating AI content and everything. So they're already moving into the space of creating a framework where AI needs to be regulated in a certain way. So for African country, beyond those who are democratic, I think the non-democratic countries are going to be the one leading the way into a much more sovereign data sovereignty in Africa, searching for an entity or a country that already has done that, and who has done that before better than China? No one. So they're going to be looking for China to do that.
We got 5 minutes left. Yes, Madame.
All right, thank you so much. It's an interesting, heating topic. It affects the daily lives of the ordinary citizens who know nothing about researching or actually taking into account or differentiating what you take into serious account, what to ignore, what's a red flag. And I think what I would like to suggest is maybe you're gathered here. It's an example. You're all gathered here as journalists coming from different backgrounds, and it's an interesting platform. So I think why not suggest to have all the journalists become their own identity in terms of consolidating your work, consolidating the work in terms of you regroup yourselves as, like, for example, do you remember how Media 24 was formulated? It was a group of different owners, different stakeholders, different entities, private sector, so they had control. Up until when they realized that certain truth or facts were coming out too much, then they started to stop the journalists from giving information. They must first research. You can't just come and get information from the horse's mouth direct, because it's interrogating, and it's sort of like character demeaning sometimes. Maybe in times when you're not researching enough, But I would say it would make sense if you can consolidate yourselves, create an umbrella.
And what would be the criteria for entry into that group? Is government media okay to go into that group?
No.
Oh, but then you've eliminated most of, we heard.
Private sectors. Remember, government.
But we've heard earlier that a lot of governments control media in Africa.
But government
tell
don't
you
always lie, though. I'm the devil advocate here. Government, I think we have to really be careful, even when you talk about governments in the media, in the press.
Yeah.
We cannot, as a society, build the basis that every news coming from the government state media is a lie, because it's not going to allow us as a country to move forward, because you're going to be always in a state of like everything they're saying is a lie, and that's really dangerous. And government media doesn't mean that's always a lie. That's going to just require us to just make the difference, the fact and everything. But we cannot just go on the premises that, no, they're lying. That's,
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous
But I
approach.
think it's very
I agree.
hard to get private sector to do that Because
No,
what's-
well-
they have to see if it's their financial interest to do that.
Yeah, because private sector is also corrupted with those who's giving the money. So
Yeah, look,
yeah.
my point is this. There's different brands, different stakeholders. See the identity of consolidating all the journalists on one incubator or one umbrella. See it as a brand child that you guys are starting up as a media platform and a journalism, I don't know whether you want to call it a ship or whatever, but it's going to take private sectors who understand there's good content that is researched and well thorough with professional journalists that really go in depth, like you said, that thing you researched against, that shows fake and now, and also it would help if there's a news that is coming out without factual. Who is interested to actually resend back that information, indicating to the masses that have read that information that this is incorrect?
Okay.
With the red cross, you know, like fake news.
Oh, I like that.
Link doesn't
let's
exist.
Let's get one or two more, then we got, everybody's hungry and tired, so, this will be the last one.
Okay, all right. So I would first want to pay tribute to Jean. I think in 2021, his work on winning Africa Fact Checking Awards inspired me for my winning work as well on the NSAS one the following year. So I want to pay tribute to him. But I think one of the solutions, we would really have to be putting a lot of pressure on tech companies, especially when it comes
And
to...
who's gonna put that pressure on $1 literally $1 trillion company?
No,
Who?
civic media,
Who?
government,
No,
civil
no, no, no,
society.
no, 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 no. I'm not going to let you off the hook here. What government is, if the United States government is not going to do it, which they've made clear they're not going to do it, is your government going to do it?
So I believe that the work that people within this space, civic media, and those with understanding about misinformation, disinformation have done, at least there's been some results. We've seen some changes on these platforms. And so I think it's something that we have to continue exerting pressure. Of course, in your introduction, you mentioned that it's not enough. But I think that there's still more that could be done. Recently, I think YouTube has announced that now for content creators, you have to classify or categorize your post if it's contains generative AI, which I think is at least some level of progress.
And you think the bad guys are going to be honest about that?
I mean, whether there is disclosure or not, I think the fact that that is there and they are thinking about it, it means that at least there's some effort. And for me, that's progress. Okay. And it means that at least they are listening to something. The other point is I think we may have to get into a lot more collaboration with these technology players. I don't know how, but I believe that some of these problems kind of goes beyond for some of us traditional journalists, our purview. We virtually have no understanding or limitation about the solutions to challenge some of these problems. That seems more of a technology problem than a journalism problem. And so if we are going to have some collaboration, I think that will achieve some results. So for instance, you know, on Google, when you are signing in an account, you have this thing that you are not a robot thing. How the system is able to identify that this was not selected by a robot and it was done by human. There should be a way that a technology can help us identify.
But this is what Jean is saying. The people who invented the technology then invented trying to detect it and couldn't find it. I mean, I appreciate the idealism and the optimism. I really do.
We will get there.
But it's a dark world right now.
Let me say we will get there.
Okay.
Let me say we will get there.
Okay, Jean, Jean, because I know we got to wrap up. Optimism, a techno-optimist there. What do you think?
I mean, at my heart, I'm an optimist as well, so I understand where you're coming from. But the reality is that it's not working like that at the moment. And for it to change, there needs to be a shift in the way that these companies invest. And they've got no financial incentives to do so. And that's the same problem that social media platforms has got at the moment. I mean, Africa in particular, we're not a big money-making area. That's why they can get away with only a handful of moderators based in Kenya that does the entire continent's moderation. And unless there's a way to, gain leverage over them, if there's, as rightly pointed out, that you've got the US that can't get the companies which is in their own jurisdiction. They can't get them to budge. They can't get them to move. So what do you think South Africa is going to do? Or Kenya, Uganda? None of these countries are able to leverage that same power. These private companies wield when it comes to internet policy and like the online spaces, they wield more influence and more power than most governments do. So trying to sway that, I mean, that's going to take a collaboration between, I would argue, not even just on the continent, but between continents itself to try and get them to budge in the way that they do these things. So I think that's the first thing, and that can be paralleled with, artificial intelligence. You can kind of use what's happened with social media platforms, the way that they've kind of run away from regulation, the way that they started out with very good ideals and got weaponized very quickly. All of that can be applied almost wholesale to artificial intelligence, where, again, very good ideals started off with. It's all of the avenues for weaponization is there. The way to try and influence them, we don't have any power or way to sway the companies and organizations developing these things.
Okay.
And they themselves don't have an incentive to do it as well.
Okay,
So I
Geraud.
don't have a good answer for you. I've got just tempering your optimism.
We don't want to depress you, okay? You're going to get the last word now, Geraud. So
Yes, no, I'm gonna
wrap us up. Bring us home.
So she has the last words. I'm gonna have
Okay,
the last
well,
question.
okay,
The last word, so I
last
can
word to
give
you.
the.
Yes, thank you. So my issue or my concern is that as a journalist who prefers to write their own work, who goes out to interview people, who spends hours looking at the different sources online and researching. I haven't used any of the AI tools, and it's because I feel like it'll be taking away what is currently working for me. So, like, how do you then get into that space where you use AI tools? Because, I mean, we are hearing in each and every conference or workshop that I've attended, everyone is talking about AI in the newsrooms, AI for journalists and all of that. But practically, how does that transition happen, especially when you've just raised what you raised now about the tools basically creating stuff that
Yeah.
doesn't exist?
Let me give you an example of how I use it. So I will take a 3-hour webinar that's boring as sin, okay, of some conference, and I'll get a transcript of it on YouTube. YouTube has transcripts of everything. Take that, turn it into a PDF, upload it to Claude.ai, and say, give me the 5 key takeaways about China from this whole conference. It only draws from that PDF. It doesn't go out onto the open internet. And I get 5 brilliant little tight bullet points done in 30 seconds. So there's lots of ways you can use AI, and I don't want to scare people away from AI. There's lots of great tools you can use it. You just have to approach it with a lot of caution and skepticism and cynicism, the same way we would approach any source. Don't trust your government source. Don't trust your corporate source. You have to, fact check and verify. AI is the same way in that respect. Oh, okay, I'm going to take. We're over time, so I want to let everybody go. Let's just very quick, 30 seconds. Final thoughts, Jean, and final thoughts, Geraud. Go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, I think the big thing to take away from this is that things are going to get worse a lot before they get better. And one of the kind of the more dangerous things about this is exactly that point that we're going to get to a situation where there's going to be more and more information out there. There's going to be a lot of it generated by humans. There's going to be a lot of it generated by AI. And we as the consumers, we as journalists, we as people who are supposed to know what's true and what isn't, it's going to become a lot harder for us to just ascertain what is true and what's not. And that's kind of the biggest danger with artificial intelligence, just that it pollutes the information ecosystem to such an extent that nobody is going to know what they can believe and what not. And that to me is one of the things that keeps me up at night.
For me, based on my experience, I would say the information that you've grounded personally directly on the ground from your coverage of different stories needs to become your basic database in your head. When you go to an AI tool, when you have information, you have to question the AI. You have to really push it to the end in a way that the information it gives you, you can really fact check it. Because if you just stopped at the surface level, as in my case, you would have you've gotten a Wall Street link, Financial Times link, and you put it in your story and you go away with it. People just see that, they assume that he's a journalist. journalist, he cannot, that must be existing. At the end, you just find out yourself, just you shared a whole total fake news from top to bottom. So yes, the knowledge that you've gathered over the years needs to become your knowledge box to fact check the information that AI is giving you.
Okay, thank you all. Really appreciate the discussion.